This presentation will discuss the requirements for local government enforcement agencies to designate authorised officers under the Public Health Act 2016 to prepare for Stage 3 of implementation of the Act. To prepare for the proclamation date of Stage 3, enforcement agencies must designate authorised officers, issue Certificate of Authority cards, and maintain a list of all authorised officers employed by the agency. This information must be ready for day 1 of the date that is set for proclamation of Stage 3. The Department of Health will advise local government of this date once it is set. Once Stage 3 comes into effect, all designations and appointments must be made under the Public Health Act and no longer the Health Act 1911. On the day Stage 3 comes into effect, a number of administrative provisions will commence operation. These can be found in Part 2 of the new Act. Division 2, the functions of a local government, which sets the requirements for the appointment of environmental health officers and for the Chief Health Officer to gazette the required qualifications and experience of environmental health officers. Division 4, authorised officers, which outlines the requirements for the designation of authorised officers and for the Chief Health Officer to issue guidelines on the qualifications and experience of authorised officers. Part 20, Section 312 will also allow for the automatic designation of environmental health officers as authorised officers for certain purposes. An authorised officer is a person or class of persons who are designated the authority to administer and enforce provisions of the Act on behalf of an enforcement agency, local government. Section 24(3) of the Act enables an enforcement agency to designate as an authorised officer environmental health officers or persons who are not appointed environmental health officers but who possess other appropriate qualifications and experience to perform particular functions under the Act or other acts, or a mixture of both. Any person appointed and then designated as an environmental health officer must have the qualification and experience outlined in the Chief Health Officer Gazette, required under Section 18. Where a person is to be designated as an authorised officer who does not have environmental health qualifications, the local government must have regard to the Chief Health Officer guideline on the qualification and experience of authorised officers. Firstly, we will look at the appointment or employment of environmental health officers under Section 17. Environmental health officers continue to be recognised in the Act under Section 17 as a profession that has the necessary qualification and experience to enforce public health law. Environmental health officers can be appointed under the Act, but any person appointed as an environmental health officer must have at least one of the approved qualifications and experience specified in the Gazette issued by the Chief Health Officer under Section 18. It is important to note that a person appointed as an environmental health officer must still be designated to be an authorised officer under the Act. To simplify the transition from the old Health Act to the new Public Health Act, on the date Part 2 of the Act comes into effect, all environmental health officers currently appointed and employed by an enforcement agency will automatically be designated as authorised officers for the purpose of enforcing both the Public Health Act and the Health Act 1911. This is outlined under Part 20, Section 312. This means an enforcement agency does not need to designate currently employed environmental health officers in writing. However, an enforcement agency will still need to issue each of these officers with a Certificate of Authority. This person is designated for the purposes of Part 8, 9, 14 and 16 of the Public Health Act and a range of sections of the Health Act and other acts listed under this section. In circumstances where the local governments of 2 or more districts have joined in the appointment of a person as an environmental health officer, this automatic designation also applies. It is important to note that any person with environmental health qualifications who is appointed after Part 2 comes into effect will not be automatically designated as an authorised officer. These designations will need to be made in writing. Now we will discuss the designation of authorised officers under Section 24. Section 24 states that an enforcement agency may designate persons as authorised officers who are an environmental health officer, a person who is not an environmental health officer, or a mixture of the two. Any person, including environmental health officers appointed after Part 2 comes into effect, must be designated in writing. Authorised officers who do not have environmental health qualifications must still have appropriate qualifications and experience necessary to perform functions under the Act. Section 25 requires persons to be designated as authorised officers to have certain qualifications and experience to perform particular functions. An enforcement agency must have regard to any guidelines issued under Section 29 by the Chief Health Officer. Under Section 29, the Chief Health Officer is required to issue guidelines outlining appropriate qualification and experience for a person or class of persons to be designated as authorised officers. This guideline will be issued on the day Stage 3 is implemented. At Stage 3, the Health Act 1911 and its subsidiary legislation will remain in place. Because the Act is being implemented in a staged manner, the Chief Health Officer guidelines under Section 29 will initially require that persons designated as authorised officers should hold an environmental health qualification approved by the Chief Health Officer under Section 18 of the Act, or have been previously appointed by the Executive Director Public Health to be appointed as an environmental health officer under the Health Act 1911, or hold qualifications and experience approved by the Western Australian Environmental Health Officers Professional Review Board. As new subsidiary legislation under the Act is implemented, these guidelines will be updated to include other qualifications and experience. Section 26 states that designations and a revocation of the designation must be in writing. The process of designation in writing is the responsibility of the enforcement agency. A record of the designation in writing should be retained. Now we will discuss issuing a certificate of authority to authorised officers under Section 30. Under Section 30, every authorised officer must be issued with a certificate of authority. An authorised officer must show evidence on request of their authorisation under the Act. This is achieved by issuing any person who is authorised under the Act with a certificate of authority or identity card. There is no prescribed certificate of authority form, but Section 30, Part 2, sets out the requirements for the content that must be included on the certificate of authority. Local government are responsible for designing and issuing their own certificate of authority cards. Under Section 30, Part 2, a certificate of authority must state that it is issued under the Public Health Act 2016 and state the name of the person to whom it is issued, bear a photograph or digital image of that person and the person's signature, state the date, if any, on which it expires, specify the Act or provisions of the Acts for the purposes of which the person is designated as an authorised officer, any provisions of an Act that are excluded from the designation, specify any conditions or restrictions to which the person's authority is subject, and bear the signature of the person by whom it is issued and state the capacity in which the person is acting in issuing the certificate. The Department of Health has produced a template certificate that may be used and amended as required. This is an example of what a certificate of authority should look like. This template is available on the Department of Health's website. As mentioned, it is not a prescribed form and can be modified to suit local government's requirements as long as it includes the content required under Section 30, Part 2. Section 30, Part 2D states that the Certificate of Authority must specify the Acts or the provisions of the Acts for the purposes of which the person is designated as an authorised officer, and any provisions of an Act that are excluded from the designation. For automatic designations, these parts are specified under Section 312. Section 312, Part B, lists the parts of the Act and other acts that are captured under the automatic designation of environmental health officers as authorised officers. This includes automatic designation for Parts 8, 9, 14 and 16, a range of sections under the Health Act, and the Dog Act 1976, Tobacco Products Control Act 2006, Food Act 2008, and the Cat Act 2011. Rather than list all the specific provisions listed under Section 312, 1 Part B, on the Certificate of Authority, it is recommended that the card simply states that the authorised officer is designated for purposes conferred by Section 312, 1 Part B of the Public Health Act 2016. In cases where the person is not automatically designated and a written designation is required under Section 24 and 26, the Certificate of Authority must list the specific acts or provisions under the Act. For example, the authorised officer is designated for the purposes conferred by Parts 8, 9, 14 and 16 of the Public Health Act 2016, the Health, Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1911, and the Food Act 2008. Note, the Certificate of Authority does not need to reference the subsidiary legislation that the designation applies to. However, if an enforcement agency believes an authorised officer should be restricted to enforcing specific regulations, this can be listed under Section 30E, Restrictions or Limitations. Where necessary, local government may issue a temporary Certificate of Authority. This must comply with all of the above criteria other than with the requirement for a photograph or digital image and/or the person's signature. A temporary Certificate of Authority may only be issued once and may be valid for a maximum period of 1 month. An authorised officer must carry their Certificate of Authority card with them. If asked to show their ID card, Section 30, Part 3, and he or she cannot, the authorised officer cannot exercise the relevant powers of the Act. Section 26 provides that a designation can be revoked in writing by the enforcement agency. Section 28 states that any person designated to be an authorised officer by a local government ceases to be an authorised officer if the designation of the person is revoked or ceases to have effect. The officer must return the Certificate of Authority to the issuer as soon as is practicable. A penalty of $1,000 is liable for anyone who does not comply. Now we will discuss the requirement for maintaining a list of authorised officers under Section 27. In accordance with Section 27 of the Act, a local government must prepare and maintain a list of authorised officers appointed, which includes details of the persons, if any, who are individually designated as authorised officers by the agency, and the classes of persons, if any, who are designated as authorised officers by the agency. In summary, it is important that the local government prepare for Stage 3 of implementation of the Act. This requires you to identify all environmental health officers employed by your local government who will receive an automatic designation. Organise Certificate of Authority cards and issue them to the environmental health officers to be automatically designated. Be prepared to designate any person employed after Section 312 comes into effect in writing. Prepare and maintain a list of authorised officers in accordance with Section 27 of the Act. Should you require any further information, this is available in the Designation of Authorised Officers fact sheet, which is available on the Department of Health's website. Queries can also be emailed to the Public Health Act email address. Thank you for listening to this presentation.